This is the pastor.
And this is the pastor's big brother who has no voice. Shut up, bastard. These next 2 hours will suck. Laugh it up.
Say, oh, sing, oh, say, can you see?
Oh, say, can you?
Oh, gosh, I want to kill myself. And this is the pastor with no answers. Jared, have you ever made the mistake of actually being annoyed by someone, thinking that they were really being out of line and maybe even a little wanting attention and that sort of thing, and then you realize they're actually mentally handicapped?
That has never happened to me. Seriously. Look, I mean, I hate to say it, but I haven't really interacted on any kind of deeper level with a mentally handicapped person.
All right,
Really?
so you've never noticed somebody in public and you were bothered by what they were doing, and then you're like, oh crap. That's never happened to you?
I guess,
Okay, so
I guess not. I guess not.
I'm the horrible person. So I'm at a wedding, and it is the rehearsal dinner. No, I'm sorry, the reception. I always get those mixed up. So it's the reception, and you know how they're calling the bridal party out, and then you introduce the new couple for the first time. Well, this one kid looked to be early college age. He keeps standing up and pointing his finger, yelling, "Yeah, man!" and yelling this guy's name and everything. And I kept looking behind me, and I was like, does this guy know that it's not his day? Why is he trying to get so much attention? It was just over the top. And I even saw people, kind of gently pushing him back a little bit because he was just going. And I was just
Was he a teen? Wow. Or, how old was this guy?
I would imagine 19, 20,
Okay.
something like that. But anyway, I was still just that's kind of annoying. I wish he would. And then I realized he just was totally mentally handicapped, and I felt so bad. I was like, oh my gosh, it's just nuts, man. You remember? I guess it doesn't matter if we say, we probably shouldn't. But you remember the guy in middle school that was mentally handicapped?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Didn't he have to be on medication to spare his life, but the medication that spared his life for some sort of a physical ailment kept him in a mentally handicapped state?
Yeah, that was the rumor that apparently he was on anti-seizure medication, but the anti-seizure medication made him act very weird.
Yeah.
And I guess it kind of induced a mental handicapped state.
Didn't he call everybody sir?
Pretty much, yeah. Regardless of sex or gender, it was just sir.
All right, so let me ask you this. All right, it's totally wrong to pick at mentally handicapped people in a mean-spirited way. It's totally wrong to be insensitive to family and all that stuff. But isn't some of it just really funny and cute? I don't even mean in a mean way, but for example, when I'm around someone with Down syndrome, I am actually built up. I feel encouraged. I feel like, man, I am a dummy for getting bent out of shape about first world problems. This is the sweetest person I've ever met in my life. It doesn't seem like they're ever rattled. They don't ever get upset. And so for me, it's almost just sometimes like the kid at the wedding after I realized his mental state. It wasn't funny in a ha-ha mockery way, but why isn't it okay to be like, oh, that's funny and cute? And am I probably ending this podcast now?
No,
Nobody's ever going to listen to it again?
I guess it's the same thing as thinking that somebody with a stuttering problem is funny, or someone with a limp is funny. I mean, they're all physical disabilities that we have. I kind of lump it in all together. So yeah, a stutterer may be very cute, but would you laugh at that person? It may look cute.
I don't know.
How is that different? How is that different?
All right. Well, because those aren't personality behavioral things. All right. So here's an example. If you think of a friend in college that would do crazy things in public, that was funny and trippy regardless of his mental capacity. So then take someone that's mentally handicapped doing the same things. It's still funny. It's not necessarily funny because they're mentally handicapped. It's funny because what they're doing is funny.
I think the difference is, though, the person being trippy in college is performing. He or she is trying to make you laugh, whereas a mentally handicapped person, they can't help it. They have no filter. I mean, it's just they just do what they do. So, I mean, I don't think you're a bad person, obviously, but it's just I think it is different.
Yeah, yeah. Regardless, it's something that you have to be super careful
Sure.
of. What do you think about the word retarded and how people use it flippantly and call people, that name and that sort of thing?
It's kind of the same thing as saying something is gay, right? I mean, that's gay. I mean, I know that that's a big no-no at school, like the school that I teach. I mean, that's like taboo. But honestly, teenagers they don't attach a whole lot of meaning to those words they throw around. So I think it's kind of being a little bit maybe overly politically correct. I don't have a problem with it.
Yeah.
But I can see though where it could rub some people the wrong way.
Yeah, dude. Have you seen the movie Idiocracy?
Yeah, I love it,
dude.
So funny.
That movie is not that old, and they use the word FAG like it's nobody's business. Like that word has become so taboo and untouchable.
Yep.
Like it was making me uncomfortable. But I guess I guess just given the fact that it's a movie and everybody understands it's comedy, but in the year 2500 or whenever it is, that's what everybody called people as a derogatory name.
Right.
I mean, it was just insane.
It's so funny too. Like I actually have hip hop albums where they won't bleep out any word but that word.
Yeah.
They actually bleep out the word faggot and nothing else is bleeped out. So yeah, I mean, it definitely has become more and more taboo. I knew when we were in middle school, we used that word all the time.
Oh yeah.
So
totally,
things have definitely changed.
Well, here's something that is interesting. Is you said in middle school we used to use that word. No excuse, not a good idea. In my opinion, it's social maturation or social evolution, progressively better. So that's no excuse. But you go 30 years before, and the N-word was used flippantly. Like when you and I were growing up, that word was not acceptable. You don't say that. Now it's just like you say that, your career's over, you're the worst person ever. But in our parents' generation, that was what you called people when when you wanted to call them something negative.
Right, or wouldn't you just say it just to refer to their color? Wasn't it?
Yeah.
Could it also be used that way? So even in a kind of a benign sense, you could still use that word and not necessarily be, making a derogatory statement. I think.
Yes. Yeah.
Definitely before our time, though.
Well, congratulations, Americans. We have progressed. Nice job for all of us. And that's some feat considering our original propensity of sin. We were born into it, man. Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today. Just what does it mean to be born into sin, and what's this whole original sin thing? Is it really in our blood, man? Is it in our blood? Well, that's what we're going to be talking to Dan Koch and Jack Hoy III about. So it's going to be fun. Keep listening. Here's our guest. Okay, so we are here with Dan Koch. You guys spent some time with Dan Koch recently, and our long-lost friend, Jack Hoy III. You are actually heard from his old man before, or more recent than you've heard from the young man. And
yeah, that's right.
Jack Hoy III, your dad is way smarter than you. Like,
this is true.
It's just unbelievable.
No, it's true. And I used to feel, because I've got a brother, too, who is also smarter than me. And for a while, I had a little bit of insecurity about that. But then I realized that being the least smart person in my family is kind of like being the worst baseball player in the Hall of Fame.
Nice.
So I'm kind of okay with that.
That was quite a humble brag there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
The Hoys, the Kennedys, the Bushes. I mean, all...
The Kennedys and the Bushes are your examples for smarts.
Bushes was an odd choice.
Hey, I'm sorry.
Odd choice.
The Bushes may sound stupid, but they're actually very smart people. And
that is true.
It maybe misutilized smartness. But anyway, so we are going to go ahead and kick this conversation off on original sin, but I have a feeling it's going to go on all sorts of rabbit trails, which is very much so welcomed. But let Jared, just for all of our amusement, just say something. Just say anything right now.
Oh, say can you? Yeah, I have no voice, so this is painful for me, as I'm sure it's painful for the audience. So.
Oh, I just can't even take it, man. I hate my life right now. Like, I really hate it. I hate it. All right, let's go through 3 questions. Very simple yes and no questions. So, Jared, that should be easy for you and your weird old man voice. First question, are we sinful at birth? No explanations, Jared.
Yes.
Jack.
Yes.
And Dan.
I hate when you do this to me.
I hate it.
I think of what you mean to say
yes or no.
I think yes.
All right, number 2. Are we in need of Jesus' salvation at birth? Jack.
Yes.
Jared.
Yes.
Dan.
Yes.
All right. Last question. Are we doomed to hell at birth? Dan.
No.
Jack. Dun, 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 dun.
Yeah, I'm going to say yes.
Boom, boom.
Assuming I get to explain that in a minute.
All right, and we're going to be saying bye to Jack just for that crazy answer that babies
Great.
are
See you,
thrown
buddy.
in hell. All right, Jared.
This is the toughest question so far. I'm going to say, I guess I'll say yes.
All right, so let me educate our audience just a little bit. I'm probably not the best person to be doing that, but I'll say it this way.
But hey, you started this podcast, so we're already kind of down that road.
Exactly. So there are people that not only would say yes to the babies being doomed to hell at birth question, but also say, from a Calvinistic standpoint, that God has chosen where that child would go.
Right.
And many people would accuse me right now of saying very emotionally charged things to make people, get on my side or something. I'm just actually stating the fact that some Calvinists would say if a baby who was not chosen to go to heaven died in the womb, it would wake up burning in hell. And okay, maybe that's true. I don't believe that. Our conversation today is basically going to be geared towards, is sin carried in the bloodline? So let me say it this way. There's a whole theology based on how could Jesus not have sin when he was half Mary. Now, I've actually read, or in my seminary studies, I like throwing that out there because it sounds like I'm really smart. But in those studies, there was one point of view saying that God supplied basically a supernatural egg, supernatural sperm, and basically just implanted the first cell or the initial cell in Mary. So it did not have anything to do with Mary except her, almost like artificial insemination. That she was like a carrier. Well, no, I guess that's not artificial insemination. What am I looking for? What's the word?
Surrogate?
There you go. She was like a surrogate for God. And that right there fixed the problem of sin being carried in the bloodline. Then other people will make a case for, no, the bloodline of the male is what carries the sin gene. And I used to know the rationale there, but I don't remember it now. So let's just ask that simple question right now, and we'll pick on Jack and Dan for some of these questions, and then Jared and I will just kind of take a front row seat and chime in when we want to. But so is sin carried in our physical blood? I mean, that sounds kind of crazy. That's definitely what I've believed for most of my life. Is it in our blood, Jack?
I don't know what that means, I guess, is my first response. I mean, I guess the other thing is I don't really care whether it is or not. I mean, to me, you know, phrasing things like this in that way, it's just kind of a nonsensical way to address it. Just like the idea that well, how could Jesus be sinless if Mary was his mother? I mean, another question you could ask is, how could he be tempted to sin if he was half God?
Right.
I mean, it's kind of trying to get at the same thing, and if you want to say that sin nature is passed down through blood, you just kind of get to some weird questions. I mean, so what do blood transfusions do? A bone marrow transplant, changes a person's DNA in some pretty profound ways. So in other words, is it possible to just get enough blood transfusions that you become functionally sinless? I mean, to me, the idea of sin being in the blood just leads to some very silly places.
You could imagine like a sect of Christianity that had enough money, like just getting blood transfusions from children below the age of accountability, or some shit like that. Like, yeah, that's just insanity, right? That's crazy.
Right. Well, that's actually a really good way of putting it. So, in other words, if you want to say that sin nature is transmitted in the blood, and you want to say that there's such a thing as age of accountability, then in other words, like at some point around puberty, something happens to a kid's blood, right? Like some sort of Spider-Man, X-Man scenario where their super sin powers, manifest. It just gets weird.
Yeah.
So you're basically reducing sin to biology. Sounds like.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's kind of right. Exactly. It really is kind of reduces a spiritual thing to biology, or at least it makes it dependent on biology. And again, not a way that's like, oh, that's terrible. It's just weird, I think.
So Jack, what? And we'll get to Dan here in a second. But what do you mean when you answered the question yes, as far as are we sinful at birth? What does that mean to you?
Well, I think it means a few things. I think that, well, one, every person is a profoundly spiritual creature.
Right.
And I think that we inherit a spiritual nature that has a corruption at its base.
Yeah.
And so while we don't come into this world with a list of sins we've committed, I think we come into existence with a nature that has been corrupted.
Yeah.
And there, there's another question of whether we've literally inherited Adam's guilt, or whether being born sinful just means that we're prone to sin ourselves. But I mean, I think that what I get from the Bible is it's a little bit of both of those. I do see this sort of idea that Adam as humanity's representative means that we all bear the guilt for his sin, which is kind of a weird idea for our highly individualistic culture, but not a weird idea for a culture that really emphasizes and values community. And, one of the things, again, over and over in the Bible you see is that we are not individualistic creatures. We're created for community, and there's no real sense of seeing yourself ever apart from some kind of community.
Yeah.
And so in other words, the idea of, well, we've inherited Adam's guilt seems like a strange concept in our culture, but I don't think it should be.
That's interesting, because I always have a problem with that. So you have no problem with saying Adam represents us, he screwed up, and so we're all screw-ups.
Yeah, and again, I wouldn't have a problem with that in the very literal sense of, in one sense, we are guilty because of our own sins as well, but I think we come into this world with the guilt of Adam, because he was our representative.
Now, you're not convinced, because I know Dan does not think this, but you're not convinced in the literal translation of Genesis with Adam and Eve and all of us coming from Adam, are you?
I'm not. What I would say is I'm not convinced that Adam and Eve are historical persons, but I don't know how deep you want to go into that.
You'll take the rest of your life to think about that one?
If they're not, I think there are some significant problems. Paul certainly talks about them as if they were. Other New Testament writers certainly talk about them as if they were real people.
Well,
but there's also
Dan thinks Paul's full of shit, so that's no problem.
No, I don't. I don't. But just
Dan,
for the sake of delineation, it might be worth jumping in for a second.
Yeah.
I don't think that Adam and I would go this way. I don't think probably that Adam and Eve were historical figures or even representatives of humanity chosen by God.
Yeah.
I do think there's a way of grounding original sin and salvation without that fact. And then circling back around, I'm totally open to them having existed.
Yeah.
But I need, for me personally, because I think the evidence is against them existing as historical people, I need my kind of faith to be based on something else that does not require that.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
So,
Jack, were you at a decent, I agree with Dan's interjection there. Were you at a decent stopping point for me to shift over to Dan, or do you have some thoughts you wanted to close up?
No, I mean, unless you guys had any questions.
I had a quick question, though.
Yeah.
So hypothetically...
Sorry, Jared, we can't understand you. Dan.
I know, it sucks. Is it really that bad? I mean...
No, I'm just kidding.
no, we're kidding.
So hypothetically, then, if you had somebody who lived his entire life without any kind of sin, he's still bound to Adam's sin?
I mean, that's kind of a hard hypothetical to answer because I don't think that's a possible scenario. But even if it were, I would say, well, I mean, if you want to take children, I think that, again, leaving aside the age of accountability, so let's just focus on infants, right? I think that in a very real sense, infants are sinners. You know, I really... It's interesting, when my wife and I had our son a couple of years ago, it really changed the way I thought about sin because, you know, I would watch the way he would act and the things he would do, and kind of the way I started thinking about it is that he's a sinner who doesn't sin. And what I mean by that is he does things that are disobedient or rebellious, or done in anger, and yet. And so, in other words, I see this sort of seed of corruption, this thing that will blossom into full-blown sin.
Yeah.
At the same time, you know, it'd be a little bit ridiculous to hold an infant responsible for that kind of behavior in the same way that we would hold an adult responsible for it. And so I don't think that, I think that everyone would agree that an infant acting in those ways is a very different scenario from an adult acting in those ways. So while I think that, you know, the behavior of infants kind of reveals this seed of corruption that's at the heart of human nature, it's not sin in the same way as we understand an adult to be. And so in other words, what I'm saying, Jared, is so this hypothetical of a person who has not committed sins, would they be still under condemnation? And I would say yes, because their very nature has been corrupted, which means that they're separated from God.
Yeah, I think I agree with that.
Okay, so I'll just jump in here, Jared, unless you have a specific question that you'd like to ask me.
No, that's okay.
Oh, I mean, Joey.
Shut up.
Joey.
What's funny is most of our listeners don't know what we were just laughing at because they're just
yeah.
That's totally
I
fair.
said Jared instead of Joey, and then Joey did Jared's voice. But so I think that from where I would draw, I mean, Jack and I agree quite a bit here. Where we would disagree is I think that there's an overall framework question here. And you can think of the gospel, the history of all humanity, and the history of an individual person through their life in two different ways. I'm sure there's more, but I'm kind of borrowing from Brian McLaren here to use this kind of geometric delineation. But he argues that, like, the Hellenistic sort of Plato-Aristotle way of doing this that most Christians do is they think there's perfection, then there's a sharp turn, there's a fall from grace, then there's a period of time out of grace, then there is salvation, which bumps you back up to the same line as perfection. So it's kind of like it's like a cliff, but it's just imagine a drawing, right? Another way of looking at it is the whole thing is a ramp, starting from a lower point and ending at a higher point. So I think the way that I fundamentally think of the story of the gospel, both in history and in my individual life in the lives of our children, not my children, I don't have any children, but your guys' children, and other children, is like when you see your son, it's like what you're seeing there, Jack, is like, or how I would describe it, is you're saying, like, he is a little kid at the beginning of that long movement up closer to God. Now, there's a point in time when Jesus came to earth, and that historical point is more significant than other historical points in the history of salvation, because that is when Christ pays for sins and shows us what God is really like. But in the life of an individual believer, we kind of start near the bottom. And so I would just say, like, everyone sins. Like, that is just the fact. Original sin for me just simply means God created beings with choice. Choice implies necessarily that we will choose rightly and we will choose wrongly. And so the concept of original sin is just like every person will choose wrongly sometimes. And I would say a lot of the time. And in fact, I think both theology and psychology have borne this out of like how constrained our wills really are. Like, we don't have as much freedom to do what we want to do as we think we do psychologically. And then spiritually, we have Paul saying, I do exactly the thing I don't want to do. The thing I don't want to do is what I do. I think that's just like totally and utterly true about the human experience. But with a little kid, I don't run into the problems of age of accountability and all these things, because I don't think that there is like some point at which, you know, a kid starts at perfection, then they reach a certain age, they get a boner, now they're in imperfection, and now they're just like, you know, jacking off until they ask Jesus to be in their life, and then they come back up to perfection. I don't think that that accurately describes what's really going on, you know, so I think that it's more like a ramp up. And so we start at one place, we're that way as a kid, which is why I answered your question, yes, we're sinful as a kid, insofar as we're humans. And then the story of our entire life is God trying to pull himself toward us.
But that almost seems like work salvation. Like
No.
think, okay.
It's definitely not work salvation. So I'm definitely not saying that our response to God's call is the thing that makes us right in his sight. That would be work salvation.
Right.
I don't think that anything we can do will do that. Now, you know that I kind of lean towards universalism, which I don't totally affirm. I don't think there's enough evidence to do that. But like, if I was going to answer the works righteousness sort of charge, I would say, no. Like, Jesus, if universalism is true, it's because of God's love for people.
Right.
It's not because of anything people do. But also, on that same tack, there's not like this pit of hell waiting for us that like we better avoid. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's neither that I am by my own merit am saving myself, because there is nothing to be saved from in that like eternal respect. There's very much something to be saved from in the temporal respect. Like, I have a disgusting heart that I see, I get glimpses into it now and again, and I go, holy shit, like, I am capable of incredible evil. That is the thing that I need saving from. I see it while I'm alive, right?
Well, see, I definitely agree with your idea of the slope or the ramp for sanctification, but I think atonement is that squared off, cliff.
Right.
Yeah, binary.
Yeah, and I know you do believe that, and I don't hold you a grudge against you for that. I don't believe that anymore. So I don't think of it, that's not the framework within which I think of salvation now. I think that if there's any binary, it's like maybe the moment that Christ resurrected, there's some sort of binary in which the Holy Spirit is available in a way it wasn't before. But I don't think there's like a moment. I mean, I think that there's moments, practically speaking, in people's lives that are like born again moments. Like, I think born again is a phrase that has real meaning. And that meaning applies more or less to different people's spiritual experience. But I mean, I have friends who, I mean, it's absolutely undeniable that they had a conversion experience. Things were different from that moment. But I would just say that's just the power of God in their life. I mean, it's just the power of God. He's choosing to manifest himself in that way in their life, starting at a particular moment. But that's not indicative of like their soul was in this state and now their soul is in this state. I'm not convinced by that view. I understand that we disagree on that, and that's fine.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's a lot of good stuff. One bad thing.
Definitely a lot of stuff. Thank you
Yeah.
for talk for 15 minutes
No,
straight.
sure. One bad thing was In middle school, it had to be sucked to be named Jack because everybody said stuff like jacking off, and your name is Jack.
That's what you got from
That's
that.
true.
Way to go.
And to a person, each of them acted as though they were the person to discover that joke.
You discovered that
To
joke.
this
Yeah.
day, that is how they act. Like right now, I'm looking at you, Joey. You were so proud of yourself.
Oh yeah. It's like Dan the man. Like, yeah, I'm 32. Yeah, I'm 32. So
And
not
when
the
your
first
mom
one.
asks you to explain why you're upset, you can't explain that.
There you go.
It's like, don't worry about that. It's nothing. It's nothing.
All right, so Dan brings up a good point. I don't think we're all on the same page as far as what the afterlife holds and what does punishment look like if we're punished and all that sort of thing. So instead of posing the question, age of accountability from the standpoint of, are younger kids spared from hell, I think how we'll pose this question is, do younger kids that may not have a sense of right and wrong, do they get the reward in full if they were to die? Like I said earlier in the episode, a Calvinist would say, well, no, you're born into sin. They needed a savior. If they grew up to be an adult, then they were chosen for hell, so they're chosen for hell as a baby. All the way to the opposite side, which would say, well, wait a second, they're not old enough to make a decision. And so we've kind of adopted this terminology called age of accountability, which basically means, and I think, and Jack, Dan, Jared, y'all correct me if I'm wrong, but I think most people do not believe in a particular bedrock age, like 12. Maybe the Catholic Church believes 12.
Person to person,
right,
kind of
right.
between
So it's
God
just,
and them.
Exactly. So it's once you start understanding, wait a second, this is wrong and this is not good and this is right. When you start understanding morality at that point, you have a responsibility to choose God. Before then, if you were to die, you're good to go. God's going to take care of you because you didn't know any better. I feel like in Deuteronomy chapter 1, there's a really good scriptural evidence for God definitely looking at age to make some decisions. Basically, it was the younger kids were able to enter the promised land, it said, because they didn't know right from wrong. But all the adults, they could not because of their disobedience. So where do we all stand on the concept of being too young to understand right and wrong, thus getting a free pass from God? So that would include if we believe that babies that are miscarried or aborted have souls that are going to last forever, they just go straight to heaven. 2-year-olds that die tragically. So where are we at with all that, Jack?
So yeah, I mean, the age of accountability, I really hate the term because it's for whatever reason
you
for
hate
me.
Kids. You hate kids except for your own.
Everyone hates kids except for their own.
Hey now, that would mean I hate all kids, which is false.
Well, so I don't like the phrase just because it sounds so kind of quintessentially cheesy evangelical. But it really gets at an important concept, which is what you said, Joey, the idea that children cannot fully appreciate not just the difference between right and wrong, but in a spiritual sense, the gravity of doing wrong. Because, even dogs know when they do something wrong. And so it's not just, again, my son's a toddler and he knows when he's doing something he shouldn't do. So it's not just knowing that some things are right and some things are wrong. It's being able to, in some sense, it has to be this ability to truly comprehend what sinfulness is, and also to fully understand the gospel. I used to walk interns here at Seacoast through Wayne Grudem's systematic theology, and he at one point kind of touches on the idea of whether babies who die go to hell, and kind of the very basic idea, which Joe, you kind of touched on, is, well, if some are predestined to salvation, then God, who knows everything, knows which babies he, just like adults, he would have where he did predestine to be with him, and which he didn't. And therefore, the idea that some babies could go to hell is sort of logically consistent with the kind of the basic idea of predestination in Calvinism.
Yeah.
And that's not the position Grudem himself takes. But when I walked a bunch of interns through that, a lot of them were
Sounds like a crazy internship,
that
man.
makes
Grudem systematic.
It makes
Woo!
chapters of it. It's like 10,000 pages. But
Yeah,
when I walked them through that chapter, a startling number of them kind of responded with, "Yeah, that makes perfect sense." And I'm like, no, wait, no, stop. What is wrong with you? You guys are really, really distressingly ready to consign babies to hell. But simply from a logical viewpoint, it makes sense. If you simply want to go from cold logic, the idea that God can predestine whomever he wills, logically, it's consistent. Now, morally, it's enormously problematic.
Right. Yeah.
Because if for no other reason, it is utterly at odds with the concept of God as a good father.
Well, Jack, what would you say when someone says, well, Jack, you just define God. You don't have a right to tell God what's good. Whatever God does is good. Because I don't agree with that, but how would you respond to that?
Well, patiently, because that's a weird thing to say. But, no, what? If someone wants to say, well, God can do whatever he wants, why can't he do that? Well, God can do whatever he wants, but God is also constrained to only doing good. Yeah. Right? God cannot do evil. He can only do what is good. And so, you have to kind of wrestle with the idea of, is consigning babies to hell good? And I think, here's the problem. I don't consider myself reformed anymore. And the reason that I really stopped seeing myself that way is because I realized that the reason I loved the God of Reformed theology was because he bore a very suspicious resemblance to myself.
Yeah.
He thought like I thought. He acted the way I would act. He saw power the way I saw power, and that was a really disturbing realization for me.
It's like a Driscoll God, a Mark Driscoll God.
It's not. Sure, Driscoll. Yeah, sure. Well, but even Driscoll, his thing on this was always, look, God is a loving father. That was kind of his answer to this question: is God is a loving father, and so in other words, the idea of babies go to hell because it's logically consistent with predestination, that is a very human way to approach that question, right? It's like, well, this is the system, and babies fit in the system, so they got to do what the system says they got to do. It's just a horrifying thing, and when your theology starts making you say horrifying things, you really need to revisit it.
Yeah.
So then I would kind of respond to that by saying, all right, Jack and I agree that there's like a morally horrifying option, let's call it on the left. And then Jack's position in the middle, which is to sort of a common sense one of like, there's got to be some kind of cutoff where a human being knows, not that they're just going against orders, but that it's sinful, knows like when they're capable of understanding the gospel, clearly enough to make a decision about it. And then at that point, in God's good grace, like he determines when that might sort of count. Am I characterizing you well enough?
Yeah, well, again, so he is our father. And so he makes, I think that he treats us the way that we treat our own children. There are, the way that I treat my son, it's not this, all right, you're 3. It's time to, I remember when I turned 16, my dad gave me like a deadline to find a job, right? There are times when there are ages and times when that's good and appropriate.
Yeah.
But at the same time, each person is different, each child is different, and good parents are able to treat each child as they should be treated.
Yeah, totally.
If that makes sense. I will say, let me say just real quick, one other thing about the idea that babies, the babies go to hell because they're sinners from birth. If that's true, right? If you want to say that God consigns babies who weren't predestined to salvation, if you want to say that those babies are consigned to hell, then, and if you want to say that the elect, those predestined by God to salvation, are numerically small, then frankly, what's the problem with abortion? I mean, if you want to say that babies go to hell because they're sinful and that the majority of babies are not predestined, then frankly, what exactly is your problem with abortion? It's just a numbers game at that point.
Literally, you could imagine somebody, a crazy person, like killing a bunch of children and being locked up and saying, "You guys all think I did something bad, but like, just wait till the final judgment. They're all in heaven, and you guys are mostly going to be in hell." I mean, it's like twisted logic, but it actually flows logically from that view.
Right.
So just to kind of finish where I was going. So I would say I'm obviously a lot more amenable to Jack's view than the Reformed Calvinist perspective for a number of reasons. But I kind of want to apply my little it's a ramp, not a binary switch thing to this situation. And I feel like it does a better job of explaining these questions. So there's the same question for both of these issues that Jack mentioned, which is, am I sinning, number one, and number two, do I understand the gospel? And I would say it's very difficult for us to think about some cutoff point where that becomes yes as opposed to no. And here's my example. When I was in junior high, I played roller hockey with my friends. And one day after school, there was like a public park right next to our junior high. And they had like just put down the like weird blue like roller hockey stuff. You know what I'm talking about? Like, it's not cement. It's like this expensive like sport court roller hockey, you know, whatever kind of some sort of like chemical compound. And the door was chained shut, but we could sneak through. And we were like, dude, brand new roller rink, no one's seeing us. So we snuck in and we went around and we skated. And like sometimes our skates were kind of catching and we were like, that's weird. So what happened is it wasn't dry yet. And as we were leaving, we could definitely tell spots that had these chunks taken out and these divots in them. And it's like, they're going to have to redo probably the whole thing, right? Yeah. I mean, they're going to have to redo at least the top layer of it. Now, when I was 13, I had some knowledge about that. I knew that I was sinning. I knew that I was breaking the rule of going in there. And I had some concept that like, oh, they might have to fix this. Now that I'm 32, I'm like, dude, I probably caused like thousands of dollars of damage. That was like a lot of work to relay that. Yeah. And like, that was kind of a big deal. And I didn't get that as much when I was younger. And I think you can pick any sort of sin like that or any kind of illegal action. And theoretically, as you get older and more mature, you have a greater understanding of what you've done and how valuable things are. I would also say I understood the gospel when I was 13, but I understand it a hell of a lot better now. So where I don't find the idea of there's some cutoff very satisfying because it doesn't seem to fit our experience. So I'm just kind of making a little small case for the ramp model of like, it does fit the experience. When you are young, you understand you're doing something wrong a little bit. Well, I know my mom said no. You get a little older, you might see your friend crying. Oh, I caused that. You have some sense that you cause pain in others, but it's not as good as I understand now. When I think about the meanest things I did as a kid, I like now realize so much better how much I hurt those people than I did when I was a kid.
So when do you become accountable?
You're always accountable, and Christ always covers your sins. I mean, that's kind of my view, right? Whether or not everybody is saved, like Christ's work is always big enough to cover every sin. And no matter where you are at in your life, the same thing is always true of God. He always wants you to know him better. He always wants to pull you closer to him. This is why I have huge problems with the saved reprobate categories, because it just does not line up with Jesus of the Gospels saying the shepherd who loses one sheep goes out and finds him. I mean, to say, well, the 100 sheep are all the elect.
You're going to run into some serious scriptural a lack of evidence in Scripture for that, right? I mean, for universalism.
Well, but I'm not necessarily saying universalism. What I'm saying is I don't think that salvation is primarily a function of one person assenting to the gospel and then having their sins covered. I don't think that that is like at the center of what's going on in a Christian's spiritual life. I would say if I had to phrase the center, it's like what's going on at the center is God made a world that he loves with humans that are infinitely valuable. And he's doing everything he can to show us how valuable we are and how much he loves us. And the most obvious way he does that is by sending himself to earth. And then our opportunity is to respond to that and to say, okay, yeah, I'm in for that. Or we can do the opposite and we can say, no, I'm going to do my own thing. Like I prefer pleasure, or I prefer power, or I want worldly goods. I don't. That seems hard, so I'm not going to kind of go down that road. That to me is the fundamental question. And when Paul is talking about election and predestination, and even when the language Paul's using for substitutionary atonement, the context of Paul is like, this is not the Jews anymore. It is now everybody. So whenever Paul's talking about that stuff, and we don't have time to go into this, from my perspective, though, I first am thinking, okay, what does Paul mean about it going from a Jewish story to a universal story? And then secondarily, how does that apply to the individual believer? So
it sounds like once that person positively affirms the gospel, that person is saved. Is that what you're saying?
I mean,
otherwise they're rejecting it.
Yeah, but I have a lot of issues with that. Number one, language doesn't work the way that we want it to work, like where it's super clear what language means. So someone saying, I don't believe that Jesus is the Savior, like can have tons of meanings depending on what they think Jesus means, what they think Savior means. Have they read the same Case for Christ that I read? Do they know the biblical evidence for Jesus' historicity?
That's way too postmodern for me, man.
No, but it's like
I can't go that way.
Here are the options. You can either go reformed, if I could very, very super simplify. You can either go reformed and say none of the postmodern questions matter because God's in control and he's already chosen ahead of time. Very simple, very Occam's razor-y. But like Jack said, giant moral problems. If you don't want to go that way, you have to admit that life's complicated and messy, and that what we mean by language is difficult, and that's why I find it so much more appealing, not just emotionally, but intellectually appealing as well, to just think, we're all on this, we're all in some place. God is further along. He wants to bring us toward him. How do we know what God's like? We look at Jesus. That is the center. And then we extrapolate out from there. And I could totally be wrong about my approach to the Bible. People disagree on this stuff, but I don't, and we already know from previous conversations, Jared, that I'm not an inerrantist. So I don't need every verse to sort of fit into the puzzle in like a very obvious way. Like for instance, Joey was talking about that Deuteronomy passage about people entering the promised land. I don't think that the Exodus is like a literal historical account. So I don't think that there was like a moment when like those kids were allowed in and the other kids weren't allowed in. I think it's like a way of saying, hey, you know how older people understand ethics better than younger people? God knows that too. And he does not hold them accountable for what they don't know yet. That's a true thing that Deuteronomy is saying about God. I totally affirm that truth about God, whether or not that was like a moment that occurred in history.
Well, just out of curiosity, before we move on from that, because I'm actually really curious about what you just said. Do you believe Moses is a historical figure?
Yeah, I think Moses probably was a guy, and I think that there were, and I'm not an expert here, so I'm deferring to like a couple people I've read. Basically, I'll name them so anybody can, just full disclosure, on the Protestant side, Peter Enns, and on the Catholic side, Richard McBrien, who are kind of good synthesizers of scholarship, and they would agree that like biblical scholars of the Exodus period are there's very little evidence that it looked as big and massive as it is in the accounts. So it's probably like there were some Jews in Egypt, and they did leave Egypt, and they came to Israel. But those, and maybe the people who told, maybe a lot of Jews thought that they were historical, maybe they didn't. That's a harder question to answer. Like, what did Jews think of their own stories? Is more difficult to answer than like, did the stories happen in a certain sense?
Gotcha.
And I don't think it matters either way. I think that the statements about God contained within are true. I think that God rescued his people from Egypt, regardless of if there was 2 million of them or 50,000 of them. I still think he did that. I still think the things it says about God are true. But again, for me, because of my ramp of salvation history, the truth claims of the earlier parts of the ramp are fundamentally less important. I mean, I'll admit that that's true. I do think that God did not command the Israelites to take Canaanite sex slaves as wives. I'm throwing out some terms that maybe are unfair. I don't think that God ever wanted them to find hot widows and like sleep with them and see if they were pleased or not. I don't think that God ever, even let's go to the New Testament, I don't think that God has ever truly wanted anyone to go to a slave and say, even if your master beats you without purpose, obey them. I don't think that that is actually what God is like. I think that is the best that Peter could do at the time that he wrote. Yeah. I know 100 people who would affirm biblical inerrancy, and if I said, hey, I'm going to India tomorrow with International Justice Mission, we're going to go free some slaves, 0 of them would say, well, Dan, I'd come along, but it'd be awkward to go up to them and say, even if your master beats you without reason, you should obey him. No one would do that. No one would come with me to India and say that to them. So I think that's fine. I think it is a long arc, and that God is pulling us Godward all the time. And as I said at the beginning, that takes place in an individual life, like we're talking about Jack's kid, and it takes place on the grand scale of human history. And to throw this out there, it takes place on the biological level within an evolutionary framework, which I know Jared does not believe, but I do.
Let's talk about generational sins real quick. Do you believe in the concept, Jack, of a dad, struggling with marital infidelity and thus increasing the risk for his sons to do the same? So in other words, that guy should, according to people that believe in generational sin, that guy should be motivated not only to be committed to his wife because that's the right thing to do and he wants to please God, but also because if he doesn't, his sons are going to have the same sort of problem. And then the flip side of that is also his sons experiencing consequences for that sin. I think to 4 generations is what a scripture says. Let's see. Numbers 14:18, the Lord is long-suffering and of great mercy, forgiving iniquity and transgression, and by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the 3rd and 4th generation.
Well, I mean, a few things. One, you again kind of have the idea of corporate guilt.
Yeah.
And which again is something that it's really interesting. It's something that we don't really understand, or something that we don't really talk about much. Although I think the ones who talk about the loudest are often those in kind of the social justice movements. The idea that Americans bear corporate responsibility for certain injustices. And there's a lot of reaction against that, but at the same time, that's a very biblical idea. I think the idea that we bear corporate responsibility for certain sins, and so there's that sort of aspect in there. But in terms of the idea of, I mean, from a very very basic level, if a father struggles with anger or if a father struggles with infidelity, the idea that his sons will too. I mean, just from a behavioral standpoint, that's obviously true.
Yeah, it seems obviously true.
But I think you're getting to something a little bit deeper in terms of, so in other words, like if we want to say that sinfulness, or at least kind of this corruption of human nature is inherited, can we inherit a similar kind of corruption from our parents? Is that kind of what you mean?
Yeah.
I wouldn't really have a problem with that. Because I mean, uh, well, let's just talk in terms of anger. Um, I can see myself inheriting or having inherited some of my dad's tendencies towards anger. And I mean, Joe, you know my dad reasonably well.
Yeah.
He probably does not strike you as an angry guy.
Right.
But that's one of the reasons is because that's something that the Lord has really done a lot of work in his life about.
Right.
When I was growing up, I a lot of my experiences with him, or a lot of my impressions with him were sort of irritation and short temper, and certainly not like the overwhelming impression I had of him, not at all. But I was very conscious when I was little that he could be short tempered, that he could be irritable, and I see that in myself now with my son, and it's something that has been very surprising to me, but also I mean also not surprising because he's my father,
Right.
and so of course I'm going to inherit not just good tendencies but bad ones too. And so, yeah, so I mean, I have no idea, I have no problem with the idea that we inherit certain tendencies towards sin from our parents. I think that's a natural thing to assert.
So do you think you could fix that by cleaning up your act? That the chances are higher for your son not to fall into the same pit?
Yeah, well, I mean,
So you
I
see
think
it as more of a practical thing than a spiritual truth.
no, I see it as both. I mean, it's a profoundly spiritual truth,
Okay.
but again, it's not something that it's not fate. It's I'm not doomed to have the same issues that my father did, but I'm also not fated to have all of the good things that he had too. Just because my dad grew in certain ways doesn't mean I'm guaranteed to grow. I mean, it's like one of the things is you just realize is that it's not so much in terms of being a father. I'm learning that it's really not so much like these big moments of I'm going to destroy my son's life. It's like these little things that I don't even think about, and then he hears something, and it hurts his feelings, and it's just because like he doesn't understand sarcasm, or it just came out in a way I never intended it to. It's like it's the little things that I realize I'm more worried about than these big moments. But it's like the idea that my son will obviously, or my son is fated to get all of my worst qualities, and there's nothing he can do about them. I mean, that's not again, that's fatalism. So it's I don't know. I feel like I'm rambling now. I guess what I would say
Welcome to the club.
I don't want to see it as purely a practical thing,
Right.
where you have these bad habits. Well, you can break those bad habits. No, it is a sin issue, but it's not your father was a drunk, so you're going to be a drunk no matter what you do. I don't believe in that either.
Yeah. Gotcha. Anybody else thoughts on that before I dive into something else?
Yeah, I thought Jax mentioned a few things that were really interesting there. The one that I'm thinking of the most is this idea of we do corporately bear guilt for some sin, or maybe Jack, you would agree, like systemic injustice or systemic evil.
Yeah.
Is that along what you're saying?
Yeah.
So I think that's like incredibly fascinating and pertinent to kind of the moment in our nation right now. And I want to kind of make a slight argument that thinking of sin too individually actually does not make us very receptive to these kind of legitimate complaints from like people who are being unjustly treated. So you think about like slavery in the South, like before the Civil War, right? And then Jim Crow laws up until the 60s. It's not like the result of that is like a bunch of individual, like it's not like everyone living in the South bears equal responsibility for, maintaining slavery or Jim Crow laws. It's like for a lot of people, they're doing nothing at all. And they're just going along and they haven't thought about it. But like they're still a part of the system. I mean, you could argue today that, I'm a part of the white privilege system, and my neighborhood where I own a house, black people were not allowed to own houses here until the 50s. Like, do I bear like individual guilt for that. There's almost no framework for that. So this is like kind of where I really like what Jack's saying about there is a corporate element to sin and evil and injustice in the world, and we do bear some of it. America no longer has slaves, so I don't probably bear any of the sin for like American black slavery. But some of my clothes are made by more or less slaves. Do I bear some of the guilt for the garment slavery industry? Yes, I do bear some of that. And hopefully one day, none of it, right? I mean, like, it's just not all about individual sin and salvation. It's like individual sin does not really get at these big things of injustice. It doesn't really have it can't tackle them, right? Like, it can't explain them. You can't explain black slavery in the Americas by like a handful of people with poor consciences. Like, you know what I'm saying? It's not sufficient to explain the phenomenon. And it's also not sufficient to explain who bears the guilt for it. Everyone who's profited from it bears some share of that responsibility. And in this kind of global sense, this is where I feel like God is sort of pulling us toward himself and showing us that there are better ways, which does not make me like a social justice liberal where I think everything is social and everything is group. I apply the exact same thing to the individual as well. It's true of both things. God's got something better for us than we currently are experiencing right now, individually and as a group.
Yeah. Word up. Well, this was something else. This is something else, man. Jared, you got anything you want to add or ask before we sign off?
Well, Jack asked me to say something, so
yes,
I'm going to go ahead and say this.
I did. I'm excited. I'm ready.
Buonasera, what have I ever done to make you treat me so disrespectfully? If you come to me in friendship, then that scum that ruined your daughter would be suffering this very day. And if by chance an honest man like yourself should make enemies, then they will become my enemies, and then they would fear you.
The best part of the podcast right there. Don Corleone, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, well then just before we end, I'm gonna give you a couple links.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's just one because most of this stuff is about Adam, so I'll save that. But I'm gonna post one link in the notes, or I'm gonna give you to post. This is for anybody who is kind of a little more interested in this ramp idea that I've been saying, because I know it's kind of high concept, and there's a church in Franklin, Tennessee called Grace Point with an E, and they call themselves a progressive Christian community. And I'm not like a progressive non-denominational guy like them necessarily in all ways, but there is an episode called Progressive Christianity is Introduction that I think does a really good job of just sort of like setting the framework. Even if you listen to me and you think I'm full of shit, it'd be, if you're interested in that topic, it's interesting they do a very good job just sort of like explaining it, and then you can go, oh, okay, agree, disagree, whatever. But I know I'm kind of, for some people, I'm probably coming out of way left field with this, and they're like, what is he talking about?
Dan, nobody thinks of you and left field together. Nobody.
Oh, yeah?
Oh, no, look, Dan says he's not a progressive. Look, Dan says he's not progressive. This is a video call, and I can see very clearly on his back wall a poster where he has photoshopped himself in a passionate embrace with Bernie Sanders.
Yeah. Thank you guys for joining us on Pastor with No Answers. My brother and I are so grateful. So grateful. Go to pastorwithnoanswers.com. Check us out. Connect with us on Twitter, Facebook, and contribute something if you'd like, man. We got some perks up now. So hit contribute, read our perks, see if anything interests you. And we'll see you next week.